I just wanted to remind everybody how important it is to rely on God in prayer, by faith, and to never give up your faith, no matter how hard things are, no matter what the battle is, but to be like good soldiers of Christ and to always look to Him for divine providence. And on this Memorial Day and at the time of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit descended in flaming tongues of fire upon Jesus' disciples, and they were able to go out and perform many miracles in the Lord's name because His Spirit was abiding in them, then let us remember that the Lord is coming again down from heaven, and we are waiting for His divine providence to be fulfilled once again. On this Memorial Day, I would like to revisit some of the incredible miracles that took place during some of America's battles in the early days during the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and just remind you that God had a plan for this nation to bring forth the gospel message to the world. And even though it may have not been a perfect nation, and there's a lot of corrupt people that do a lot of corrupt things that are ungodly, but there were divine miracles that took place by the hand of God. And so I just wanted to share a few of these miracles and answers to prayer, truly incredible historical events where God intervened on the field of battle to bring forth His will and bring forth what He had planned for this nation. There are countless miracles, big and small, that run through our history. Many credit nature, coincidence, but we know the truth, as the song God Bless America says of our beautiful country, God shed His grace on thee. So very true. The key to preserving patriotism in this country is to keep remembering the miracles and God's divine providence. And we should share these stories with our family members at dinner and talk together about it, what it might have been like to live through some of these miraculous moments. Faith and prayer. Now, remember, when you ask for prayer or you connect with people in prayer, you're not doing it because, and this is something I wanted to mention because I just saw somebody comment that they had been attacked for asking for prayer. And when I asked for prayer, there were a couple of people who said things such as, "Where's your faith, girl?" It has nothing to do with not having faith. Asking for prayer has everything to do with gathering people together to strengthen the prayer, and that God hears the prayers when two or more are gathered together. And furthermore, comments such as, that you're weak if you ask for prayer. And that isn't necessarily so. You may be very strong, but you may be going through tribulation and troublous times, but you are having faith, depending and relying on God and asking people to combine their prayers with your prayers so that the more the merrier, that God would hear in heaven and heal our land and answer our prayers. Mine particularly for a home to get my things out of storage, which I desperately need to do and have needed to do for 2 3/4 of a year. But it's a difficult thing to do by yourself. I needed divine providence. I need God's help. And God has shown me many miracles, many of which I wrote in my book, The Almond Tree, Aaron's Rod, the Messiah, King of Israel. Available at Olive Press Publisher. It's all about Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah, the King of Israel. And many miracles He performed while I was writing that, and I wrote them all down. And this is just a Memorial Day to remember the troops, to remember the ways in which God intervened. So I want to honor my American Revolutionary ancestors that fought in the battle to protect this country, and my Civil War ancestors that fought and survived miraculously, because, you know, with my Civil War great-great-great-grandfather, I found records that their regiment knelt to pray before the battle. And he was a Christian and sang in church, and they sang songs before the battle. And I know he was one of them that was kneeling in prayer. And he never was wounded, never had a gunshot go through him, a bullet, and neither did his brother. And a third brother was a Civil War drummer. After I went to get their military information at the Fredericksburg battlefield, which they were not part of that battle, but they were in Shiloh, and I was asking God, I was doing genealogy, I was asking God, you know, being a percussionist, I would love to find this brother that played the snare drum during the Civil War. And would you believe, as soon as I got home, I had postings on genealogical sites, and this man contacted me that was that brother's ancestor. And he sent me pictures of his Civil War drummer brother. And it was just divine providence. There's so many things I could tell you that were exciting stories. I found their grave sites. I found a huge marker, American Revolutionary graveyard that had these two buried side by side that fought and battled together. And they went through many things and hardships. And one of our mottos is flourishing in sunshine and shade. That's one of our family mottos from Scotland. Now let's look at this from tomorrowsworld.org. Concentrated efforts to eliminate any reference to God in American schools and media by the left, I should add, and the supposed debunking of the Bible by academics, scholars, have resulted in widespread biblical illiteracy and a tragic ignorance of the true facts involved in the birth of the United States, especially the incredible role that God's intervention played in the American Revolution. God guides the course of history and makes nations great and destroys them. He enlarges nations and guides them. We see this in Job 12:23 through 24. The prophet Daniel records the same important message, that God removes kings and raises up kings. So he's going to remove the last king that Israel puts on the earthly throne, and he's going to raise himself up on that throne. And he's been raised up as the resurrected King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. And we see this in Daniel 2:21, 4:7, 25, 32, and 5:21. But what important facts have American and the world forgotten? And did God really intervene to guide the outcome of the American Revolution? What sort of evidence is ignored and seldom mentioned today? And which is why I'm bringing it up today on Memorial Day and the time of God's divine providence when he came down and descended on his disciples and filled them with his power to go out and heal and perform divine miracles. So George Washington in Boston, this story, George Washington played a leading role in the American Revolution and the nation's founding. His solid character and firm convictions were key factors in molding the nature and outlook of America. However, the fact that he lived to lead this young nation appears due to what was called divine providence. the intervention of God in mankind's affairs for a purpose. In 1755, during the French and Indian War, 23-year-old Colonel Washington was one of 1,400 British troops under the command of General Braddock, marching to capture Fort Duquesne near Pittsburgh. Now, this is where my ancestor, one of them, fought in this particular battle. When they were attacked by the French and Indian force, and during the battle, Braddock was killed and every officer on horseback was shot except Washington. The young colonel later wrote to his brother, "But by the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectations, for I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me." A Native American who fought in the battle later stated, "Washington was never born to be killed by a bullet. I had 17 fair fires at him with my rifle, and after all could not bring him to the ground." This is a quote from Miracles in American History by Federer, page 17 through 19. Years later, during the early spring of 1776, with the British in control of Boston, Washington ordered cannons brought through the snow from Fort Ticonderoga, some 300 miles away, to fortify Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston Harbor. Seeing the danger, British General Howe ordered an amphibious assault on the American position. However, the night before the assault was to begin, a hurricane or terrible storm, a southeaster of gale proportions, hit the Boston area and disrupted Howe's plans. So he called off the attack on the American positions due to the badness of the weather. As a result of the sudden storm and the strength of the American position commanding movement in and out of Boston Harbor, General Howe ordered the British troops to evacuate Boston. Washington again wrote to his brother, "This remarkable interposition of Providence is for some wise purpose, I have not a doubt." And then they had this dense fog and snowstorm and freeze. In the summer of 1776, General Howe had a British force of more than 400 ships. Can you imagine 400 ships? And 32,000 troops stationed around Staten Island in New York Harbor. George Washington gathered about 8,000 American troops to Brooklyn Heights on the western edge of Long Island. The British were able to land about 15,000 troops behind Washington's lines and inflict heavy losses on the Americans, who were encircled on Brooklyn Heights with their backs to the East River. However, the weather again proved to be a deciding factor. Strong winds, an ebbing tide, and incessant rain kept the British from further attacks on the American position and from moving their warships into the East River to cut off an escape route. Washington, realizing the danger of his position, ordered a nighttime evacuation of Long Island. That evening, at about 11 p.m., the wind died down and a thick fog developed, shrouding the American evacuation. And when the fog lifted later the next morning, the British were surprised to find that the American soldiers were nowhere to be found. And one American soldier wrote, "Providentially for us, a great fog arose, which prevented the enemy from seeing our retreat." The outcome of this battle has been described as so astonishing that many, including General Washington, attribute the safe retreat of the American army to the hand of God. If the wind, rain, and the fog, termed the heavenly messenger, had not intervened for the Americans, they would have been captured. Washington would have been hanged, and the revolution would have come to an early end. In December of 1776, with morale low and the American army dwindling to about 2,000 at Valley Forge, Washington declared to cross the ice-filled Delaware River and launch a surprise attack on the British in Trenton, New Jersey. The Americans attacked at sunrise on December 26th through a driving snowstorm, with the wind at their backs and blowing into the faces of the mercenary Hessian troops, who had been celebrating Christmas the day before. In less than an hour, the Americans captured nearly 1,000 Hessians and lost only a few men. Artillery officer Henry Knox wrote of the victory at Trenton, "Providence seemed to have smiled on every part of this enterprise." Following the surprising American victory at Trenton, General Cornwallis was sent to engage Washington and his troops, who had recrossed the Delaware River and were deployed around Trenton. Traveling over muddy roads due to rain and a January thaw, Cornwallis eventually pinned Washington and his troops with their backs against a little creek. Believing he had Washington trapped, Cornwallis decided to wait till the next day to bag the fox. However, during the night, there was another providential change in the weather. The temperature dropped, freezing the ground and allowing for easier movement of men and materials. Washington's troops left their fires burning and evacuated their camp. They were able to move over the frozen roads to attack and defeat British troops in Princeton behind Cornwallis, endangering his supply lines. The surprising turn of events in favor of the Americans happened because of a providential change in the weather. The escape from a trap and victory at the Battle of Princeton were seen as evidence of God's hand in these events. Then we have another crucial turning point that occurred in the summer of 1777. British General John Burgoyne was marching down the Hudson River Valley from Canada with a force of 7,000 men to join General Howe, who was supposed to be marching north to Albany, New York. However, Burgoyne was stopped at Saratoga by a force of more than 15,000 Americans, who were angered by the brutality inflicted by Burgoyne's Native American allies. Failing to defeat the Americans, Burgoyne and his troops began a retreat, only to be caught in a rainstorm that turned the roads into a slimy bog. When the Americans crossed the Hudson River ahead of him and blocked his escape, Burgoyne and 6,000 of his troops surrendered. General Howe never made the trip up the Hudson, as his reinforcements and supplies coming from England were prevented from reaching America for 3 months due to contrary winds. Don't you remember when the disciples were on the Sea of Galilee and they were in the boat? The winds were contrary to their rowing and was fighting against them. And then Jesus said, "Be still," and the wind stopped and the sea was calm. I mean, this is just extraordinary. It gives me the chills. So, the British were given contrary winds. The defeat of one of Britain's best generals in North America by colonials was a shock to London, but it was viewed as a miracle in Paris, as it was a turning point in the Revolutionary War that brought France into the conflict on the side of the Americans. General Washington wrote of this event, and he said, "I most devoutly congratulate my country and every well-wisher to the cause on this signal stroke of Providence." And Roger Sherman, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, wrote, "This is the Lord's doing and marvelous in our eyes." So cool. In the fall of 1780, the treasonous action of General Benedict Arnold, the hero of the Battle of Saratoga, was discovered by a surprising turn of events. Arnold was plotting to turn the American garrison at West Point, a key position for the control of the Hudson River, over to the British in return for a payment of 20,000 pounds, about $1 million in today's money. Several American sentries happened to stop Major John Andre, dressed as a civilian, as he attempted to return to British lines. In a hollow space in his boot, they found a map of West Point and details of an impending attack. The unexpected apprehension of Major Andre and the discovery of Benedict Arnold's treachery was widely viewed as an act of divine protection. A providential miracle detected the conspiracy of Arnold. The body of the American Army then at West Point, with His Excellency General Washington himself, were to have been rendered into the hands of the enemy. Wow, isn't that amazing? So then we have the story in January of 1781, when American General Daniel Morgan defeated an advancing British force under General Cornwallis at the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina, in what has been called a tactical masterpiece and turning point of the war. After the battle, Morgan retreated north, chased by the British. Cornwallis reached the Catawba River only hours after the Americans had crossed, but a sudden storm made the river impassable. The British nearly overtook the Americans at the Yadkin River, but again rains flooded the river, slowing the British, and another flash flood blocked the British at the Dan River, allowing the Americans to cross into friendly territory in Virginia. British General Henry Clinton described these events as follows. Here the Royal Army was again stopped by a sudden rise of the waters, which had only just fallen almost miraculously to let the enemy over. George Washington wrote in March of 1781, "We have abundant reasons to thank Providence for its many favorable interpositions on our behalf. It has at times been my only dependence, for all other resources seem to have failed us." So General Washington was counting on God and God's divine hand of protection. The culminating battles of the Revolutionary War were also decisively influenced by the weather. In October of 1781, an inconclusive engagement between the French and British fleets in the Atlantic, prolonged by shifting winds, allowed another squadron of French ships with troops and supplies to slip into the Chesapeake Bay, preventing British supply ships from reaching Cornwallis, who was surrounded by 17,000 French and American troops in Yorktown, facing overwhelming odds. Cornwallis attempted a nighttime breakout by starting to ferry his regular troops across the York River. The first group made it safely across the river. However, a sudden and severe rain squall blew the second contingent of soldiers downriver, leaving Cornwallis with a much reduced force. This sudden adverse turn of the weather completely disrupted the attempted breakout, and as a British colonel commented, thus expired the last hope of the British Army. Cornwallis surrendered the next day, while a British military band played "The World Turned Upside Down." The American victory at Yorktown has been called one of the most influential battles in history, as it ended an 8-year struggle for independence and launched America on a path to becoming a world power. And it was aided by a sudden and dramatic change in the weather. After the pivotal Battle of Yorktown, Yale President Ezra Stiles wrote, "Who but God could have ordained the critical arrival of the Gallic fleet so as to assist in the siege of Yorktown?" Several years later, George Washington wrote, "It will not be believed that such a force as Great Britain has employed for 8 years in this country could be baffled in their plan of subjugating it. The singular interpositions of Providence in our feeble condition were such as could scarcely escape the attention of the most unobserving, while the perseverance of the armies of the United States through almost every possible suffering and discouragement for the space of 8 long years was little short of a standing miracle. Yet the critical role of divine intervention is seldom mentioned today." And it's really tragic because you hear all kinds of slandering against George Washington. So the general feeling during and after the Revolutionary War was that God had blessed the American effort for independence, and the hand of God had intervened again and again to guide events at this crucial time. But few remember this today. In 1787, when 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin urged the Continental Congress to begin their daily deliberations with prayer, he commented, "I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. As the Bible states in several places, many modern Americans and citizens of the world have forgotten this important lesson of history that is plainly revealed in the Scriptures. The Bible reveals that failure to transmit the true facts of history and the willingness of leaders to ignore important lessons of history will have serious consequences for America and other Israelite nations in the Western world." The words of the biblical prophets ring out through time. Jeremiah records God's warning. "Because my people have forgotten me, I will scatter them as with an east wind before the enemy." His words are consistent in the pen of Ezekiel. "Because you have forgotten me and cast me behind your back, therefore you shall bear the penalty of your lewdness and your harlotry." And he was talking to Israel, the scarlet harlot of Revelation. This is one of the verses that clues you in as to the harlot riding the beast is. And so, because she played the harlot against God, she was scattered into all the nations, where she brought bits and pieces of mystery, Babylon the Great, of whom she is. And she's deceived many. So, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being priests for me. Because you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. That's Hosea 4:6. God is going to allow nations whose people ignore his instructions and forget how he has intervened on their behalf to reap what they have sown. And might I also add that we are going through many trials and tribulations while we live in this world. And there are those that are killed in battle, things that innocent people have borne the brunt of without justice. One of the things that really got to me recently was seeing the little girl with blood all over her hands and all over her clothes on the bus as they took her out of Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Uvalde is a place where my ancestors built the first one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a church. And it greatly affects me. My great-great-grandfather had a ranch house there and was responsible for the first schoolhouse. So this breaks my heart, seeing these injustices. I had many injustices done to me at the time of my mother's death that should never have happened. I don't care what the excuse is. People deal with trials, tribulations, and injustices. And the more of us that gather together to pray for and with each other are lifting up prayers together in, solidarity. And God hears our prayers. Think about 400 years of the Hebrews, I should say, in Egypt that were enslaved, and they were doing back-breaking labor as slaves, making mud brick, and then hay was taken away so they couldn't use hay to make the bricks as a punishment. And they do have these mud bricks to this day with Pharaoh's stamp on it of his name. So it's got the Pharaoh's mark, the maker's mark, which is like the mark of the beast. Okay, a beast is a king. So the king stamps with his crown, his name, his title, his number onto the things that he creates, things that he manufactures, everything, the money, all has the king's mark upon it. So this is what's going to happen in the future. Now, I wanted to speak about this War of 1812 miracle. This is timetogetready.org, and the background to the war. Just a few decades after miraculously winning the American Revolution, in 1783, the United States of America once again was at war with Great Britain, hoping to punish the Americans for their precious rebellion. The British were intent on humiliating them and regaining their lost colonies. So see, when you have an article written that Donald Trump was working with the governor of Mississippi to try to make America part of the Commonwealth of Britain, this is not a good thing. This is reversing course. And not only him, but the people on the left, doing all kinds of things. And we just have to be very, very cautious and careful of the history of these people and what they are doing. Now, America was once again at war with Great Britain, and they were hoping to gain control again. In an attempt to provoke another war, they searched and seized over 1,000 American ships on the Atlantic Ocean. Worse yet, they forced into military service over 6,000 American sailors to aid them in their fight against Napoleon. This was a fate considered to be worse than death, for sailors were either forced to fight the French, their former allies, or be imprisoned for the duration of the war in abandoned ships, where the widespread diseases, starvation, and foul water led to certain death. The American public was outraged at these actions, and Congress promptly declared war on England in 1812. Now, I have ancestors that fought in the War of 1812. And this is really interesting. I have it actually written out where they fought in this battle. And one of them was a blacksmith, and he forged cannonballs and bullets for this war. The war, now referred to as the War of 1812 and the Second War for Independence, was considered over before it began. The newly formed United States was no match to the greatest empire the world had ever known. So do you think that King Charles III could become the world leader, the king, over the World Economic Forum and the globalists, since they were formerly the world's greatest empire and military force? Since they were the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and militarily especially. Now, I want you to think about King Charles III becoming the world leader, the king, over the whole global nations. Okay, the newly formed United States was no match to the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and they were the greatest military empire. And Israel is looking for a military leader that, does certain things that they approve of, okay, as their king. Great Britain controlled the economy, had the latest technology, and proudly boasted to be the best and largest military in the world. And one of the things that Israel expected of the Messiah, the anointed one who's a king, was for him to be a great military leader and to protect them, which the UK and Israel just signed a 7-year trade and tech agreement to bring their forces together. And Israel has been talking behind the scenes with certain rabbis, and the Palestinians have been talking about becoming part of the UK Commonwealth countries that King Charles III rules over. So this is very easily how this Gog Magog, which is in London, and go watch my videos about the Royal English Oak Tree and all of that information. It'll give you great insight into this. But think about the fact that the British Mandate was controlling the Holy Land in the early 1900s, and that because of that British Mandate, it's very easy for Israel to become part of the Commonwealth of Great Britain, and to have King Charles III be a figurehead of the monarchy. And even though Israel has, a certain government that it has now, I was talking about them reviving the monarchy with a king on it. There was somebody who kept misinterpreting what I was saying, so I want to clarify that. But here, let's just listen to what happened here with this British offense strategy. Now, with all of that past history of the kings of England, and now King Charles III just newly being anointed, and he's bringing the tech and trade, and he's in control of all of the military of the UK, including the Royal Navy, which was the most powerful military in the world for hundreds of years. It's going to rise again here. And with few exceptions, the United States lost nearly all of the battles between 1812 and 1814. The British strategy was complex, but could be simplified to three main objectives to defeat the newly formed country of America. First, they would destroy the capital of Washington, D.C. Secondly, they would destroy the northern United States through Lake Champlain. And by the way, I think it was the American Museum up in the Smithsonian, there is George Washington's tent that he camped out under. It was very similar to the valances and the drapes that my grandmother had in her living room. It was uncanny. When I saw them, I just about flipped out. And they had this ship that was hurriedly built out of green wood, and it sank in Lake Champlain when bullets were shot and cannonballs were shot at it. It sank because there was no time to dry the wood, because these troops were coming, and they built it out of green wood, and therefore it survived for a couple of hundred years, and they dragged it up out of the lake, and it's in the museum. It's really cool to see. And then lastly, and I'm going to say this like you say the city, lastly, they would destroy the South through New Orleans, is what people say, but down there, New Orleans. This three-pronged offensive strategy would cut the nation off from all angles, weakening their defenses and preventing them from receiving outside assistance, or so they thought. However, God intervened to protect America and its newfound democracy, which was actually a republic, but we're constantly brainwashed with the democracy, and commitment to religious freedom. Let us take a few minutes to see how God intervened to thwart British plans to destroy America and her constitutional rights. The Battle of Washington, D.C. Miracle. On a hot summer evening in August 1814, the British invaded Washington, D.C., the newly formed capital of the United States. They burned the White House, several government buildings, and much private property. Due to her quick thinking, Dolly Madison saved the original Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and the famous painting of George Washington. And I've been to the Madison house with my family when they were renovating it. And there's a whole nother story in my book about Madison and his gardener and all of that. You've got to read it. It's really cool. But I went with my mom and my siblings and stuff to Madison's grave, and Dolly Madison's grave was right there. So it was right there at her grave. And she was a hero because her quick thinking saved the original Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and famous painting of George Washington. And she did this by taking a knife and cutting around the frame and taking out the painting of George Washington, and she rolled it up and she saved it because she couldn't carry it in the big frame. And by doing so, she saved this painting from so long ago. And this in and of itself was quite a feat, for the British were intent on crushing American morale. As the British felt that their mission in Washington, D.C. was accomplished and proceeded to nearby Baltimore, 3 miracles in the weather assisted the Americans, thus defeating the British. An immediate rainstorm put out the fire, saving Washington, D.C. from utter destruction. An unexpected hurricane devastated the British Navy, whipping their ships around in chaos and making it impossible to proceed with their offensive on water. A sudden tornado incapacitated the British Army on land. According to Ian Harvey, National Weather Service reports that more British soldiers were killed as a result of the storm than had been killed in the battle the day before. 2 British cannons were even lifted up and moved by force of the accompanying tornado, which ripped through the middle of the city. What makes this event even more serendipitous for the Americans is that, as Smithsonian reports, there have only been 7 other tornadoes recorded in Washington, D.C. in the 204 years since. Can you imagine? God used a tornado to pick up the cannons. They're extremely heavy, of course, and they were moved out of position so they couldn't fire upon the Americans. That is incredible. And I just wanted to say here that President and Dolly Madison are responsible for my Cedar of Lebanon miracle that you can read about in my book, The Almond Tree, Aaron's Rod, the Messiah, King of Israel, because it was really a miracle. And God caused me to find and discover where they came from. So this was an extraordinary story of a miracle in and of itself. But let's carry on with some of these miracles against Britain, against the tyranny of this monarchy that was trying to control and establish its power and authority here. The Battle of Plattsburgh miracle. Then a month later, after they tried to burn down the White House, the British attempted to invade from Canada in an effort to take the northern United States. Conflict ensued at Lake Champlain, where 14,000 British fought against 5,000 Americans. They were outnumbered, unbelievably. Not only were the American numbers significantly lower, but they were also greatly inexperienced. The British soldiers were battle-seasoned veterans who gained their experience fighting Napoleon and his armies on the battlefields of Europe. The Americans were recent militiamen who had formerly been farmers, shopkeepers, and tradesmen. The world's finest navy fought the world's most inexperienced navy. Yet after 2.5 hours, the American soldiers won. Never underestimate your prayers and the power of God. And never fail to come together with other Christians to pray together in unison to God. While there were not any drastic changes in the weather, as had been in previous battles, the unexpected victory was credited to be a miracle by many veterans. Additionally, the unexpected victory, called the Battle of Plattsburgh, halted British invasion from the north and was critical in getting them to sign a peace agreement in 1815. And then we have the Battle of Nolens miracle. While Great Britain was willing to sign a peace treaty in 1815, they were taking months to negotiate the terms, hoping that an unexpected win on their end would grant them a last-minute victory. Now, I have no doubt that the ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson came to Texas, the oil-rich, cattle-rich state of the United States, to try to get an inroad there. Okay, I just wanted to throw that in. And while exchanging formalities with American ambassadors in Europe, the British were sailing 8,000 battle-hardened veterans through the Gulf of Mexico to attack the Americans in New Orleans. Hearing news of their sneak attack, General Andrew Jackson quickly rallied the city to the defense. The 4,500 American men that were able to fight were a mix of pirates, free African Americans, Indians, and backwoods frontiersmen. They were not typically a group that relished working together, but their attitudes were changed after he notably gave a patriotic address about having to unite together. General Jackson did all this while recovering from the wounds of 2 bullet holes in his left arm. In just 30 minutes, there were 2,000 British casualties with only 100 American losses. President James Madison proclaimed, "History records no example of so glorious a victory obtained with so little bloodshed on the part of the victorious. The American victory at the Battle of New Orleans ended the War of 1812, and soon thereafter peace between the two countries was officialized in the Treaty of Ghent." Throughout the Bible, there are dozens of examples of times where God performed miracles and turned the tides of battles. As we study the history of the United States of America, we can see that this time of protection was foreordained by God. Let us encourage ourselves on what God has done on behalf of our nation and in our personal lives. Even more so, let us value our constitutional rights and use this time to spread the good news that there is a sovereign God who is divinely interested in nations, but most importantly, personally invested in every individual. He is coming soon, so let us share that with as many people as possible, that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again to reverse the curse of Adam and Eve, to take us back into the Garden of Eden-like state so that we could dwell in a Garden of Eden-like situation with a restored New Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was the place of the Garden of Eden, and Jesus reversed the curse of death in that place, at the place of Garden of Eden, and now he's the rock quarried out of God's holy mountain, and in the end he comes and shatters the kingdoms of this world and takes away all elements of Babylon, which started with his own people in Jerusalem. So let's not forget that God's divine providence is happening in our day and age. And even though we may be surrounded on every side by evil, by troops, by armies, by warring factions, by dictators, let us not forget that God is our help. And he's a very present help in times of trouble. And he intervened in the founding of this nation. And he will do so again. And he will fight the enemies of God. And he will allow the righteous to prevail. And even though there's injustice in the world right now, justice is coming at the time of the pouring out of God's wrath. In the time of the tribulation, when God's wrath is poured out on the unbelieving, the ungodly, and those who do not put their trust in the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Let us lift up the glory of our King. Let us lift up the glory of Messiah, Yeshua, the rightful heir of the Davidic dynasty of King David, and enthrone him forever and ever and ever to be our King. Never stop praying for other people, and never chastise them in any way if they want you to come together in prayer with them. And I hope you find a lot of exciting information in this video, because I wanted to remind you that God is a God of miracles, and He does mighty deeds that are just, you just can't even fathom how it happened. I've seen it time and time again. I sat down in my garden and I was asking about the Holy Spirit's divine presence, and every time I would say, "God, is that you?" it thundered and crashed lightning, and people saw it on my video. So there's so many other things that have happened. And even though we go through these times that we're tested beyond measure, not necessarily because of something we've done, but bad things are always happening in this world until the Lord comes to rule over it, because Satan is having his heyday and he's doing all these injustices. But God is going to make it right, and people will weep no more. They will sorrow no more. We will be in everlasting righteousness and joy. But for people that think that we're constantly in a state of smiling right now, I just think that's laughable. Somebody said that to me, and I just thought, what world are you living in? We don't live in a perfect world. We don't live in a restored world. We live in a cursed world. And we're not going to be having a smile plastered on our face all of our life, like some of these Christian denominations seem to think, that you're supposed to go around smiling all the time. And I'm thinking, do they read the Bible? Do they read that King David cried on his bed and wept? And he played songs on his harp because he was distraught? Do they read about Jeremiah being the weeping prophet? Do they read about Job? Job going through trials and tribulations when everything was taken from him. Was he constantly smiling and cheerful and joyful? No, because we are in a sin-cursed world. So I just wanted to share some miracles of God that saved this nation from the very empire that could be the one in the very end times in the book of Revelation, sitting upon a revived throne,